The morning crowd froze when a bloodied shepherd collapsed on the bakery floor. No one knew his name, but the trail he carried would change everything. The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops when the doors of Maria Delgado's bakery swung open, letting in a gust of cool air and the comforting smell of rising bread. The regulars were already gathered, sipping coffee, waiting for their warm rolls and sweet pastries. Laughter and small talk filled the air, the kind of ordinary peace people take for granted. But that peace shattered in an instant when every head turned toward the door. A gasp spread like a ripple through the room. Chairs scraped back, and mugs froze in midair. Standing there was a German shepherd, his once proud coat matted with mud and blood, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. His paws slipped on the polished floor as he stumbled forward, each step leaving behind a dark, wet print that broke the rhythm of the morning. He was large, scarred, with a body that told a story of too many battles, but it was his eyes that stopped everyone cold. Amber, sharp, unyielding even through the haze of pain. People whispered, "Is that a police dog?" Someone else muttered, "Whose dog is that?" But no one moved. The shepherd staggered into the center of the bakery, his legs trembling, and then, as if the weight of the world had finally caught up to him, he collapsed with a heavy thud against the tiles. The sound of it echoed louder than any crash of pans or clatter of plates. Maria, her apron dusted with flour, rushed forward on instinct, her hand outstretched. But before she could reach him, the dog lifted his head and let out a low, warning snarl. His lips curled back, teeth stained, a sound not meant for cruelty but for protection. His gaze never left the front door. It was as if he was telling them all, "Not yet, not safe, don't touch me." Maria froze, her heart pounding. She had worked with animals before, strays and rescues that wandered near the bakery's back alley for scraps. But this was different. This was no stray. This dog was on a mission. The regulars backed away, murmuring in fear and confusion. But nobody left. They couldn't. Something about the shepherd pinned them there, held them in the gravity of his presence. His breathing was ragged, uneven, every inhale a struggle, yet his focus never wavered from that door. Blood pooled slowly beneath him, trickling from wounds that looked fresh, deep, deliberate. Not the wild tears of barbed wire or careless accidents, but cuts that spoke of knives, of men, of violence. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "He's looking for someone." The words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment no one dared disagree. Maria crouched lower, her voice trembling but soft. "It's all right, boy. You're safe here." But even she could hear how empty that sounded, because safety wasn't what he wanted. The shepherd lifted his head again, blood dripping from his muzzle, and stared at the door with a fire in his eyes that chilled everyone watching. Then, with what little strength he had, he shifted his body toward it, dragging himself forward an inch at a time, leaving behind a trail that looked less like blood and more like a path he demanded they follow. Maria's hand shook as she crouched beside the bleeding shepherd, her phone pressed to her ear while her other hand hovered just above his trembling flank. She spoke in a whisper meant more to calm the animal than to be heard by the 911 operator. Her words spilled out in a mixture of Spanish and English, broken with fear. But she made sure they understood that a dog was badly hurt and bleeding in her bakery, and that something about the way he looked at the door was wrong. The dispatcher promised help was on the way, but Maria already felt the seconds dragging like hours. She could hear the dog's breath rasping, short and uneven, the sound of a body running on nothing but willpower. The regulars stayed back, their faces pale, their eyes darting between the trail of blood smeared across the tiles and the wounded animal who refused to give in to weakness. One man muttered that it wasn't safe, that Maria should step away, but she shook her head sharply. She couldn't. There was something about the shepherd's eyes, that amber fire even in his pain, that told her he hadn't come here by accident. He had chosen her bakery, and she could not abandon him. Minutes later, the wail of sirens cut through the sleepy morning, and the glass door swung open again. This time, to Sheriff David Hayes and 2 deputies. Hayes was a broad man, gray at the temples, with the kind of expression that made people straighten when he entered a room. But even he paused when he saw the dog. His gaze followed the smeared paw prints across the floor, the spatters of blood, the way the shepherd lifted his head and growled low as the uniforms approached. Maria stood quickly, relief flooding her, though her voice trembled as she explained everything in a rush. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He knelt low, careful, his hand hovering near his belt, but not for his weapon. He studied the wounds on the dog, saw the deep gashes along the shoulder, the punctures near the ribs. "Some of this blood is his," he muttered, "but not all of it." The words hung heavy, more chilling than the sight of the blood itself. The dog's head turned slowly, his gaze locking on Hayes with such intensity that even the sheriff felt the weight of it. The growl deepened, not wild, not senseless, but deliberate, as if the dog wanted to speak, and this was the only way he could. Then, just as suddenly, the growl cut off, and the shepherd's muzzle shifted toward the door. His body was shaking, but his meaning was clear. "Follow me." Hayes exchanged a look with Maria, who clutched her apron tightly in her fists. "He's leading us somewhere," she whispered, her eyes wide with something that felt like both fear and faith. Hayes rose, his voice calm but commanding as he ordered his deputies to secure the scene. Then he pointed toward the trail of paw prints smeared with blood that led back out into the street. The shepherd was trying to guide them, and Hayes knew better than to ignore an animal who had already fought his way through hell just to get here. The shepherd lay on the cool tile of the bakery floor, his sides heaving, blood soaking into the cracks between the squares, and yet there was a stillness about him that unsettled everyone watching. Sheriff Hayes crouched low, studying him closely, noticing the absence of a collar, no tag, nothing to tell them who he belonged to or where he had come from. The dog's fur was scarred in more than one place, old wounds crisscrossing his flank like maps of battles long past, and one ear was notched, as if it had been torn in some forgotten fight. His muscles, even trembling with exhaustion, spoke of years of endurance and training, the kind of body that didn't happen by chance. The sheriff called for Dr. Patel, the town's only veterinarian, who arrived in minutes with her bag slung over her shoulder and her hair pulled back tight, her face pale but focused. She knelt beside the shepherd without hesitation, her hands steady even when his amber eyes snapped open and fixed on her. He didn't snarl this time, but the warning was still there in the weight of his stare. She murmured softly to him, her words a low hum, while she examined the wounds along his chest and shoulder. When she drew her hands back, the gloves were streaked red, and she shook her head grimly. "These aren't scrapes from running through woods," she said, her voice low but carrying in the silence. "These are knife cuts, clean, deliberate. Someone attacked him." The crowd stirred uneasily, and Maria pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Hayes frowned, leaning closer, his eyes following the blood trails smeared along the shepherd's fur. The vet added, "And yet, most of this blood isn't his. Look at the pattern. He's carrying it from somewhere else. He fought, yes, but he was fighting for something." The dog's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, his eyes still burning with an intensity that unsettled even hardened men like Hayes. The sheriff had seen soldiers return from war with that same gaze, a look that belonged to those who had seen too much and survived anyway. It was not the look of a lost pet or a runaway stray. This dog was on a mission, and the bakery was never meant to be his resting place. He had come here because he needed them to see, to follow, to understand. Dr. Patel tried to stem the bleeding, pressing gauze against his wounds, but the shepherd pushed against her touch, lifting his head despite the pain, eyes sliding again toward the door. His body trembled with weakness, yet there was no surrender in him. His purpose was written in the way he strained forward, in the way his gaze sharpened whenever anyone moved closer to the exit. he wasn't done. He wouldn't be done until someone listened. The sheriff stood, his voice rough as he addressed the room. This dog's not running from something, he's running to something. And whatever it is, it's out there waiting. The words sent a chill through the crowd, and for the first time, Maria realized the blood streaks on the floor were not just signs of suffering. They were breadcrumbs. A message in red, left by a dog with no name, who refused to stop until someone followed where he led. The radio on Sheriff Hayes's shoulder crackled loud enough to break the heavy silence in the bakery. Every head turned as the voice on the other end came through, sharp and urgent. A child was missing, 10 years old, Lily Harland, last seen walking to school just after sunrise. Her mother had called when she never arrived, and her backpack had been found torn open near the woods that bordered the edge of town. The words seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud. Maria dropped the cloth she had been pressing to the shepherd's wounds, her eyes wide with fear, and a murmur of shock rippled through the gathered crowd. Sheriff Hayes straightened, his jaw tightening. His gaze shifted back to the shepherd lying on the bakery floor, his fur dark with blood, his breathing rough but determined. The animal's amber eyes flicked open at the sound of the radio call, and for a moment, it seemed as if he understood. He lifted his head, ears twitching, and tried to push himself upright. His legs trembled, his body sagged, but still, he strained toward the door, as though the news had only confirmed what he had already known. Hayes knelt down, his boots squeaking against the blood-slick tile. He studied the shepherd with a mixture of disbelief and wonder, the thought forming sharp and clear in his mind, though it sounded impossible even to him. Could this dog be trying to lead them to the girl? The cuts on his body, the trail of blood he had carried in, the way he had snarled when anyone tried to stop him, and most of all, the way his eyes never left that door, it all began to take shape as something far greater than coincidence. Dr. Patel shook her head, her hands pressing against fresh gauze, but the shepherd pushed against her touch again, his growl low and insistent. "He's too injured to move," she whispered, though her own voice lacked conviction. The shepherd raised his muzzle, ignoring the sting of his wounds, and fixed Hayes with a stare so steady it felt like a command. The sheriff held that gaze, feeling the weight of it settle in his chest, and he thought of Lily Harlan's torn backpack lying in the dirt near the woods. Maria crossed herself quietly, whispering under her breath. "He knows," she said. The deputies looked at each other uneasily, shifting from foot to foot, waiting for Hayes to give the order. Outside, the town moved on unaware, children laughing as they passed by, car horns echoing in the distance. But inside the bakery, the world had narrowed down to the bloodied shepherd, the missing girl, and the line of red paw prints that led out into the street. Hayes stood slowly, his hand brushing the radio clipped to his vest. "Get a search team to the woods now," he said, his voice low but firm. Then he looked down at the shepherd, who was already straining to rise, trembling but unwilling to quit. "We're going to follow him," the sheriff added. And in that moment, everyone understood that this scarred, nameless dog might be the only one who knew where Lily Harland was, and that his trail of blood was more than a sign of pain, it was a map leading them straight to her. The shepherd rose on unsteady legs, his paws slipping slightly on the blood-stained tiles, and before anyone could move to hold him back, he pushed his weight forward and staggered toward the door. Maria gasped, calling for him to rest, but he didn't pause, didn't look back. Sheriff Hayes signaled the deputies to clear a path, his eyes locked on the dog as if afraid to miss a single move. The glass door swung wide, and the German shepherd limped into the daylight, each step heavy, but full of a purpose that silenced the morning street. People stopped mid-stride, staring as the wounded dog dragged himself forward, leaving behind a fresh trail of crimson on the sidewalk. The deputies followed at a distance, the sheriff close behind, and Maria stepped out of the bakery doorway, her apron stained with flour and blood, whispering prayers under her breath. The shepherd turned down an alley weaving past trash bins and crates. His body swaying with the effort, but his eyes never wavering. He moved like a soldier who had taken too many hits, but still refused to surrender. His breath came in ragged bursts, echoing against the brick walls, but his determination carried him further than anyone thought he could go. The trail twisted through back streets and across the main road. Traffic halted by the deputies, raising their hands and shouting for drivers to wait. Horns blared, voices called out, but still the shepherd pressed on, as if the world behind him no longer mattered. He led them past shuttered shops and boarded windows until he stopped suddenly at the edge of an old storm drain near the woods. The dog lowered his head, sniffed the rusted grate, then erupted in furious barking that made the deputies flinch. His voice was deep and commanding, the kind of bark that carried more than sound. It carried urgency, warning, demand. Sheriff Hayes dropped to one knee and peered through the grate, his flashlight cutting into the shadows below. For a moment there was nothing but leaves and debris, damp from last night's rain. Then the beam caught on something small and bright, tangled in the metal bars. He reached in carefully with gloved fingers and pulled it free. A ribbon, pale blue, smeared with dirt but unmistakable. Hayes turned it over in his hand slowly, his breath catching. Lily's mother had told them she tied that very ribbon in her daughter's hair that morning before school. The sheriff's hand tightened around the scrap of fabric, his jaw set hard. He looked at the shepherd, who had gone silent now, watching him with those amber eyes that seemed to know the truth already. Hayes rose to his feet, holding the ribbon high for the others to see. Gasps broke from the deputies, and Maria clasped her hands to her chest. There was no doubt. The dog had led them straight to the first real sign of Lily. Hayes gave the order for more units to search the area, his voice carrying across the street like a bell of urgency. The shepherd lowered himself to the ground, exhausted, blood seeping from his wounds, but his gaze remained sharp, fixed on the dark mouth of the storm drain as if daring anyone to doubt him. He had done his part, and yet something in his eyes said this was only the beginning, that the ribbon was just the first clue on a trail only he could truly follow. The shepherd refused to rest. His body was weak, every step leaving another print of blood on the ground, but his eyes burned with a fire that pushed him forward. Sheriff Hayes wanted to hold him back, to lift him into the back of a patrol truck, but the moment anyone reached out, the dog snapped his head away and dragged himself onward. It was clear now that stopping him would be like trying to stop a river that had already carved its path. The deputies exchanged uneasy looks, but none dared to argue when Hayes motioned them to follow. The trail led them beyond the storm drain and through the back streets, until the pavement ended and dirt roads began. The shepherd's pace grew quicker, his paws hitting the ground with a rhythm that made it clear he was following a scent, not stumbling at random. Even with blood streaking his legs and his ribs shuddering from effort, he pressed forward with a certainty that silenced the men behind him. Each time he slowed to sniff the air, his ears flicked sharply, and then he would surge ahead again, pulling them deeper into the forgotten edges of town. The houses thinned out, giving way to wide fields and broken fences, until finally the tree line loomed in front of them. The woods were thick and dark even in the daylight, a place whispered about by hunters who told of trespassers, strange lights, and trucks that appeared at odd hours before vanishing into the hills. Most people avoided it, calling it cursed or unlucky. But the shepherd stopped at the edge as if he had been here before. He lifted his head, nose to the wind, and stood so still that even the birds seemed to fall silent. His ears twitched, catching sounds too soft for human ears, and the deputies felt the hairs on their arms rise. Then, without warning, the shepherd bolted. His legs, though battered, carried him in a sudden burst of speed that shocked everyone. Sheriff Hayes swore under his breath and motioned to the deputies. They sprinted after him, branches snapping underfoot, their hearts pounding harder with every step. The forest swallowed them quickly, shadows weaving through the canopy, the smell of damp earth and pine thick in the air. Ahead of them, the dog moved like a streak of muscle and willpower, cutting through the undergrowth with the precision of something born for this hunt. The deputies stumbled to keep up, sweat running down their necks, breath burning in their lungs. They could hear the dog barking ahead, sharp and urgent, the kind of bark that demanded they not slow down. Hayes pushed harder, his boots sinking into the mud, his flashlight beam trembling with his stride, though the sun was still high above. Somewhere in the distance an engine growled, faint but undeniable, and the shepherd's barking grew louder. The men exchanged glances but did not stop. The dog was pulling them towards something, maybe someone, and the thought of Lily Harlan's ribbon tangled in that storm drain burned in every mind. Whatever shadows lived in these woods, the shepherd had faced worse, and with every furious bark and every crimson paw print, he dragged the humans closer to the truth waiting just beyond the trees. The forest grew thicker as the deputies struggled to keep pace, branches clawing at their uniforms and roots catching their boots. But the shepherd tore through as if the shadows themselves parted for him. Blood streaked his fur, yet his stride never faltered, his nose low to the ground, ears twitching at every distant sound. Sheriff Hayes could feel his heart hammering, not just from the run but from the certainty that the dog knew exactly where he was going. Then, as if guided by an invisible hand, the shepherd slowed and veered off the faint deer path, pulling them into a thicket where the trees pressed close and the air felt heavier. Through the underbrush, the outline of something unnatural appeared. A structure hunched low against the earth, covered in tarps weighed down with stones and brush to make it blend with the woods. At a distance, it looked like nothing more than another pile of debris, but the closer they came, the clearer it was. A shack, crude but deliberate, hidden from anyone who didn't know to look for it. Hayes raised his hand, signaling for silence. The men froze, their breaths harsh in their throats, their ears straining against the quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The shepherd stopped just short of the shack, his body rigid, fur bristling along his spine. A growl rumbled from deep in his chest, low and steady like the warning of a storm. His amber eyes glowed with a fierce light as he locked his gaze on the door, every muscle in his battered frame drawn tight. Hayes mouthed for the deputies to circle, but before the order could even form into sound, the shepherd lunged. He hurled himself forward with the force of something far larger, crashing against the warped wooden door with his shoulder. The impact rattled the frame, the tarps shaking loose to reveal more of the shack beneath. The deputies surged in, weapons drawn, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The smell hit them first: damp wood, rotting food, and something sour that made their stomachs twist. The beams of light swept across the room, catching on chains bolted into the walls, stained blankets piled in a corner, and half-crushed food wrappers scattered across the floor. Sheriff Hayes's chest tightened when his light landed on a small, torn jacket crumpled near the wall. He recognized it immediately, the bright yellow fabric streaked with dirt, one sleeve ripped almost clean off. Lily Harlan's jacket. Maria's voice from earlier echoed in his memory, her whispered prayers, the way she had clutched her apron when she saw the ribbon. Hayes bent low and picked up the jacket, his hands trembling despite years of steadying themselves in worse places. He turned it over slowly, knowing without question it belonged to the missing girl. The deputies exchanged grim looks, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. But there was no child in the shack, no Lily, just the remnants of her presence and the gnawing certainty that she had been here not long ago. The shepherd paced the room, nose to the ground, whining softly as if calling for her. He stopped at the far wall, pressed his nose to the boards, then barked once, sharp and urgent. Hayes's stomach dropped. She was close, too close to ignore. The shack was silent, except for the rasp of breath from the deputies, and the low growl from the shepherd as he pressed his nose against the far wall. Hayes signaled for one of his men to check the boards, but before the deputy could step forward, movement shifted in the shadows. It was quick, a flicker that seemed part of the darkness until it wasn't. A man burst from the corner with a knife flashing in his hand, his face twisted with rage and something far more dangerous. The deputies shouted, raising their weapons, but they didn't need to fire. The shepherd launched himself across the room like a bolt of fury, jaws snapping shut around the man's wrist before the blade could strike. The impact sent both of them crashing to the floor, the knife clattering against the boards. The man screamed, thrashing, but the shepherd held fast, teeth sunk deep, his growl vibrating through the air like thunder. Hayes was already moving, his gun trained, while two deputies swarmed in, wrestling the man's free arm behind his back. The shepherd didn't let go until the cuffs clicked shut, and even then he lingered, amber eyes locked on the prisoner with a hatred so sharp it made the room colder. Blood dripped from the man's wrist, splattering across the dog's muzzle, but the shepherd only released him when Hayes gave a sharp command. The suspect slumped between the deputies, his breath ragged, his lips curled into a grin that didn't belong to someone afraid of prison. He spat blood onto the floor and started laughing, low at first, then louder, echoing through the shack like something unholy. One of the deputies shoved him toward the door, cursing under his breath, but the man twisted his head back, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You'll never find her in time." The words froze Hayes where he stood. His grip on his weapon tightened, but it was not fear that took hold. It was fury. Maria's bakery, the ribbon in the storm drain, the yellow jacket on the floor, it all rushed through his mind in a flood that made his chest ache. Lily Harland was alive. The man's words confirmed it, but they also carried a cruel clock, ticking louder with each passing second. The shepherd barked once, sharp and commanding, then turned his nose back to the far wall, as if to remind them he had already found the path. Hayes snapped out of the moment, his voice carrying like gravel. "Get him out of here, now!" The deputies dragged the suspect away, his laughter trailing behind him like smoke. The sound made Hayes's skin crawl, but he pushed it aside and dropped to his knees beside the wall. The shepherd pawed at the boards, his claws scraping, his whole body shaking with urgency. Hayes pressed his ear against the wood and swore he heard it too. The faintest sound, muffled, almost like a sob swallowed by the earth. The sheriff met the shepherd's gaze, that fierce amber fire burning even through exhaustion. "She's close," Hayes said, his voice breaking. The dog pressed his nose harder to the wall, whining low, as if to say there was no time to waste. The shepherd's claws tore at the boards with a fury that seemed to come from something deeper than instinct. Each scrape echoed in the tight space, wood splintering, dust rising, until the deputies finally understood he wasn't just pacing, he was showing them the way. Hayes barked for crowbars, and within seconds 2 men were prying at the warped planks, while the dog kept digging, growling every time they slowed. The floor groaned, then split open with a crack, revealing a dark gap beneath. The smell that rose from it was damp and sour, the smell of earth that hadn't seen light in years. Flashlights cut into the opening, revealing rough dirt walls and a narrow path running straight into the ground. Hayes's stomach dropped as he realized what it meant. Someone had built this place to hide what wasn't meant to be found. Before anyone could stop him, the shepherd shoved his muzzle into the gap and forced his body through, scraping his ribs against the broken wood, his fur streaked with blood. He vanished into the black with only the sound of his nails clicking on hard, packed dirt to mark his presence. "Damn it, we'll lose him," one deputy muttered. But Hayes was already lowering himself down. The earth was cold against his palms, and his flashlight beam trembled as he aimed it forward. The tunnel stretched narrow, barely wide enough for a grown man to crawl, and the air was heavy with moisture and mold. Ahead of him, the beam caught the flash of movement, the shepherd's tail, lashing with urgency as he pushed deeper without hesitation. The deputies followed, one by one, their radios crackling faintly with static as the earth swallowed them. Every breath echoed, magnified in the tunnel, every scrape of boots against dirt sounding louder than gunfire. The further they went, the darker it became, as though the forest above had been erased from the world. Only the sound of the shepherd kept them steady, the steady panting, the occasional growl when he caught the scent of something ahead. Blood marked the ground where he passed, fresh drops glistening in the light, but still he pressed on. Hayes felt his throat tighten, watching the animal push himself beyond what his body should allow. The shepherd's ribs heaved, his legs shook, but his determination never faltered. Hayes thought of Lily Harland. The ribbon, the jacket, the laughter of the man they had just arrested. He clenched his jaw and kept crawling. The tunnel twisted sharply, the walls damp, roots poking through like skeletal fingers. A faint sound drifted through the earth, something soft, muffled. Hayes froze, listening hard. It was faint, but there, a whimper carried through the dirt. The shepherd's ears flicked, and he barked once, sharp and commanding, then surged ahead with new strength. "Move!" Hayes ordered, his voice rough. The deputies scrambled behind him, hearts pounding, as the tunnel began to widen. The air grew colder, and the beams of light swept forward, revealing an underground chamber. The shepherd stood at the threshold, his body shaking, but his eyes burning bright as fire. He had brought them here, through blood and pain, and Hayes knew with a certainty that this was where the truth waited. The tunnel widened into a low cellar carved roughly into the earth, its walls damp and streaked with mildew, the air thick with the smell of rot and oil. Flashlight beams cut across the space, catching on metal tools, crates, and stained blankets thrown haphazardly against the corners. Then the light landed on a small figure in the farthest corner, curled tight against the wall, rope binding her wrists and ankles. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes, wide and terrified, shone when the beams found her. Lily Harland. The shepherd was already moving before anyone else reacted. His paws stumbled across the uneven floor, his breath rasping, his body shuddering with exhaustion, yet he pressed forward until he reached her. He lowered his head and pushed his muzzle into her bound hands, his fur warm and wet with blood. Lily gasped, then her trembling fingers curled against him as if she had known he would come. "You came," she whispered, her voice hoarse but steady enough to pierce every heart in the room. Sheriff Hayes's chest tightened as he signaled the deputies forward. They rushed to her side, knives slicing through the ropes, voices low and soothing as they told her she was safe now. Lily clung to the shepherd even as the cords fell away, her thin arms wrapping around his neck, her face pressed into his matted fur. She shook with sobs, but they weren't only from fear, they were from relief, the kind that floods through when hope arrives in the form of a scarred dog who refused to give up. The shepherd stood still for her, his legs trembling under the weight of his own failing strength, but he did not pull away. His tail gave the faintest thump against the dirt floor, as though to tell her he was glad she was alive. Then, as the deputies lifted her gently into their arms, the shepherd swayed. His head lowered, his eyes blinked slowly, and before Hayes could reach him, his body gave out. He collapsed heavily onto the ground, blood seeping from reopened wounds, his chest heaving shallow breaths. "Get him up!" Hayes barked, his voice cracking. Two deputies dropped to their knees, pressing gauze and hands to the worst of the bleeding. But there was too much, and their fingers came away red. The vet would be needed, but time was slipping faster than they could count. Lily struggled against the arms holding her, crying out, "Don't let him die! Please, don't let him die!" Her voice broke through the chaos like a bell, and Hayes felt his throat close. He crouched beside the shepherd, resting a steadying hand on his side, feeling the faint rise and fall. "Stay with her," he whispered, his voice low but firm. "You've brought her this far. Don't stop now." The shepherd's eyes opened a fraction. The amber glow dimmed, but not gone. He looked at Lily one last time, and she pressed her small hand against his ear. "You saved me," she whispered. His chest rose in a long, rattling breath, then stilled into something frighteningly shallow, as though he had given all he had left to bring her home. The waiting room of the small town veterinary clinic was filled with a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the walls. The bright lights overhead did nothing to soften the tension, and the hum of machines from behind closed doors was the only sound that reminded them the fight for life was still happening. Lily sat on one of the hard plastic chairs, her small body curled forward, refusing to move even when her mother tried to coax her into resting. Her hands never left the shepherd's ear, stroking the scarred skin with a tenderness that made grown men turn away so they would not have to show their tears. His head rested in her lap, his body swathed in bandages, IV lines snaking into his legs, machines beeping steadily to track a heartbeat that faltered too often. "He saved me," Lily whispered to anyone who would listen, her voice trembling with exhaustion but firm with truth. She repeated it over and over, as though saying it aloud could anchor him to the world. Deputies who had followed the trail from the bakery sat nearby, their uniforms streaked with dirt, their faces pale. None of them argued with her. They had seen the dog bleed for her, fight for her, drag himself through darkness no man would dare enter. They knew she was right. Sheriff Hayes stood by the window, his arms crossed tight, his jaw set. He had led men in dangerous hunts before, had seen loss and tragedy, but watching the shepherd fight for every breath cut deeper than anything he could remember. This wasn't just a dog, not anymore. This was the reason Lily was alive, the reason her torn jacket wasn't the last piece of her left behind in the woods. Hayes felt a lump in his throat when Lily leaned closer to the shepherd, whispering secrets into his ear, the way children do when they believe only one listener in the world can understand them. Hours passed with the slow crawl of dread. Nurses and the vet moved in and out of the surgery room, their shoes squeaking on the tile, their eyes avoiding the waiting family. Each time the door opened, Lily's head snapped up, her grip on the shepherd tightening. She would not leave him, not even to eat, not even when exhaustion pulled at her eyelids. "If he could fight that hard for me," she said softly, "then I can sit here for him." Her mother wept quietly beside her, stroking her hair, while Hayes pressed his hand against the wall to steady himself. The machine that tracked the shepherd's heart fluttered unevenly, each dip in the rhythm pulling a gasp from the room. Dr. Patel's voice came low, warning that the next hour would decide everything. Lily bent her face close to his ear again, her tears dampening his fur. "Please don't leave me," she whispered. "You're my hero." The shepherd's chest rose, shallow and weak, but it rose still. No one in the room knew if he would make it, but in that moment his loyalty had already written itself into their lives forever. The weeks that followed felt like the town itself was learning how to breathe again. The woods no longer seemed so heavy with secrets, though people still lowered their voices when speaking of what had been found there. The storm drains had been searched, the shack dismantled, and the tunnels sealed. Lily Harland was home, safe in the arms of her mother, and yet it was the battered shepherd who had become the heart of every story whispered across dinner tables and over cups of coffee. The dog who had bled across streets and alleys, who had scratched through darkness, who had collapsed only after pressing his muzzle into a child's trembling hands, was no longer nameless. To the town, he was a hero. To Lily, he was family. The bakery became a place of gathering more than ever before. Maria baked loaves shaped like paw prints. Children tugged their parents to the shop just to peek inside in case the shepherd was there, resting on his blanket by the counter. He had healed slowly, ribs still faint beneath his coat, scars etched deep into his skin. But every time Lily entered, he lifted his head, his amber eyes softening as his tail gave a single thump against the floor. She always knelt beside him, whispering things no one else could hear, brushing her hand over the notch in his ear as though it was a crown instead of a wound. One morning the town gathered outside the bakery, drawn by the sound of brushes scratching against brick. A mural was being painted, each stroke bright with purpose. By the time the sun had set, the wall was transformed. Where once there had been faded white paint, now stood the image of the shepherd, tall and proud, His scars turned into streaks of light, his eyes blazing with the same fierce devotion that had carried him through blood and fire. At his side was Lily, small but unafraid, her hand resting against his shoulder. Behind them stretched a trail, not painted in red but in gold and white, a path of light that seemed to lead forward into the sky itself. The crowd grew silent as the final words were stenciled beneath the mural. He left a trail we could follow. He gave the lost their voice. Maria stood at the front, her apron dusted with flour as always, tears bright in her eyes. She turned to where the shepherd lay resting at Lily's feet, his ears twitching at the sound of paintbrushes being set aside. She lowered herself onto her knees beside him, her hand gentle against his fur, her voice low enough to be meant only for him. "You didn't just find her," she whispered. "You saved us all." The dog lifted his head slightly, the faintest sound rumbling in his chest, not quite a bark, not quite a growl, but something in between that felt like an answer. The townspeople stood together, their hearts bound by the courage of a battered German shepherd who had walked through blood and shadow to bring a little girl home. In Oak Ridge, his story would never be forgotten. Thank you for watching this video of a dog's devotion. If you like this story, show your support with a like, and join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.